Episcopal churches that colored persons have the same privileges as whites, unquote. And I quote again, "The quality of relations enjoyed by Black and white was the rallying cry which gathered the people to us," reminisced one missionary veteran in the Southwest. Freedmen who had apostatized to the Mother Methodism periodized the observations of whites. The church was the only church for Black men, averred one prominent Negro convert, because it welcomes all Americans, white or colored, to the equal treatment of its privileges. The 1868 General Conference seated 2 African-American representatives elected by their respective annual conferences. These early steps were hopeful signs for the church's African-American membership. The number of Methodist Episcopal Church African-American congregations grew, and some white congregations were also formed in the South, presumably among carpetbaggers and others drawn to Methodism, but not to the Southern Methodist Church. Provision was made for conferences to be segregated if requested by conference members, and African Americans saw segregated conferences as a step along the way towards full inclusion into the life of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Given the disparity in education and training between Black and white church leaders, exhorters, class leaders, ordained preachers, and so on, segregated conferences were seen by some as an interim training ground for African American clergy. What was welcomed as an interim step by Black Methodists became over time a source of concern, as full inclusion in the life of the Methodist Episcopal Church seemed to remain a promise on paper. Though the 1884 General Conference elected African Americans as a secretary of the conference, secretary of the Committee on the State of the Church, and editor-in-chief of one of the church newspapers, other actions and discussions of that conference were viewed by at least one African American observer as evidence that the segregation of the Southern conferences was extending to other aspects of church life. As the 19th century came to a close, African Americans within the church increasingly called for the election of an African American bishop and expressed frustration that their calls remained unheeded. These calls came as race relations in the United States deteriorated considerably, as lynchings became commonplace and the Supreme Court officially sanctioned Jim Crow with its 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. In the early 20th century, as African Americans began to leave the rural South for urban areas both South and North, race riots became a feature of American life. Widespread racial violence in summers of 1910 and 1919, also called Red Summer, which came, those summers of riots were followed by the widespread wholesale massacre of Black communities in Oklahoma in 1921 and Florida in 1923. With rights and basic protections for African Americans absent in the civic sphere, surely the Methodist Episcopal Church would lead the way in demonstrating to the nation the efficacy and wisdom of including all equally. The racially troubled early decades of the 20th century were also the conversations about unifying the Methodist Episcopal Church with the Methodist Episcopal Church South took on greater seriousness. From the start of those discussions, it was clear that the presence of African Americans in a unified church would be a point of contention. Although slight changes in polity and practice had evolved in the years the church was separate, the biggest obstacle to union was the status of its African American members. As one of the Southern members of the Joint Commission on Unification noted, quote, "We all know and we have known from the beginning that the crux of the situation is that status of the colored membership in the Methodist Episcopal Church. We can arrange everything else. And yet, when we come to that, if we can't arrange that, if we come to a deadlock on that, it renders null and void everything that we have done before." End quote. The Methodist Episcopal Church South would have preferred to have had the African American members of the Methodist Episcopal Church join in a mega African American Methodist church with the AME Zion, and CME churches. But that was much further than the Northern Church and its African American members were willing to go. After years of discussions, a proposal that was made early in the process by the Southern Church was refined and adopted over the objections of African American members. The new Methodist Church adopted a jurisdictional structure, dividing the church into regional areas within which clergy would be identified, nurtured, and ordained, and bishops would be elected and assigned. In addition to these regional designations, there was a non-geographic central jurisdiction into which the vast majority of African American clergy and churches were herded. This arrangement assured only be challenged by African Americans for a week or so every 4 years at General Conference, and by those serving on church-wide boards and commissions. Members were promised. Even though this arrangement ostensibly allowed for a reunion of the Northern and Southern Methodist churches, it's debatable as to whether it can be seen as effecting a true merger. The jurisdictional system was instituted over the objection of the church's African American members. The fact that they were segregated from their white brothers and sisters is evidence that they were not properly merged into the new structure. Beyond that obvious note, the jurisdictional system itself was established to intentionally resist the effect of true merger of South with North. The geographically based arrangement was designed so that areas of the country would maintain their distinctive character. Since the election and assignment of bishops and clergy would normally take place within a fixed geographic region, prevailing ideas and practices in the region would be nurtured and reinforced, free from external challenge. In other words, racial mores and racist practices would continue unchallenged in the South. John Moore, a bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, who served on the Joint Commission on Union, phrased it more gently this way: there is still a North and a South in this country, and there is still an East and a West, and they are not merely geographical. They are social, economic, ethnic, cultural, civilizational, ideological. To be sure, they are not so extremely so to be divisional, but they are sufficiently distinct to create varied human characteristics and values. Each of these great sections has produced values that should be conserved and promoted. As Jim Crow grew and matured in the first half of the 20th century, there can be little doubt concerning which Southern values would most be conserved and promoted. It must be noted that even the creation of the central jurisdiction was too much interracial merger for some Southern Methodists. One group of dissidents described the actions of the final Methodist Episcopal Church South Conference in this way. The Birmingham General Conference in 1939 decided to enter into a union with the Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Protestant Church. When the three were formally united in 1939, there were many in the Methodist Episcopal Church South who refused to enter into the union because of the modernistic tendencies found in the United Church. And let me just say here, I want to give a public thank you to Dale Patterson for finding this in the archives and emailing it to me that I might use it in this paper. The group formed the Southern Methodist Church in 1940. Though not specifying which modernistic tendencies it found objectionable in the newly formed Methodist Church, it proudly declared itself to be, quote, doctrinally and spiritually basically the same as the Methodist Episcopal Church South, end quote. The Methodist Episcopal Church South, by uniting with the Northern Church, had somehow in their eyes allowed itself to be stained with the, quote, alarming infidelity and apostasy found therein, unquote. Again, no specific charges were made explicit. In examining their stated doctrinal claims about justification, sanctification, good works, atonement, the sacraments, etc., this examiner found nothing that might be found objectionable to a current United Methodist Board of Ordained Ministry, except perhaps the section on Satan, angels, and demons. Now, apparently concerned about tyranny from an episcopacy, they had, quote, no bishops or presiding elders, unquote, choosing instead to have a president serve a 4-year term. I'll say this to their credit, and despite their claim to, quote, perpetuate the faith of John Wesley, as did those faithful contenders who have gone before us, unquote, they included the following among their beliefs. Segregation is a segregated church. We believe that integration, as it relates to the white and colored races, for which so many are clamoring, is not the answer to current social problems. In fact, it is our opinion that such integration would produce more problems than it would solve. If you're curious, the Southern Methodist Church exists. And if you go and dig, you'll find that its current website does not advertise its current beliefs with the same level of detail found in this publication they put out in the 1950s. Church, its African-American members petitioned for the dismantling of the Central and the true merger of the church's black and white members. Perhaps an acknowledgement of the presence of African-American members, by 1948, the General Conference had included the following in its social creed. We repent of our blindness to the actual situations which have developed in society. Therefore, applying the social problems of our day, the Methodist Church declares as follows. 1, we stand for the equal rights and complete justice for all men in all stations of life. And then if you follow along to number 14, they also throw in, we stand for the rights of racial groups and insist that the above social, economic, and spiritual principles apply to all races alike. Apparently, the church's expressed principles and complete justice for all, unquote, did not implicitly require integration, and nothing more was deemed necessary to add before 1956. So in 1956, there was an entire subsection that touched on race, and it read, E, freedom from discrimination. We stand for the rights of racial groups and insist that the social, economic, and spiritual principles set forth in this creed apply to all races alike. We urge individual Christians and churches to make a serious and prayerful examination of their own attitudes and practices in regard to racial equality and fellowship, with a determination to bring practices into conformity with Christian faith, unquote. Important to note that the General Conference that year in '56 met 2 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision and in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so that General Conference boldly called its churches to prayerfully examine their attitudes and practices. I suppose it decided that, fortunately, beyond voting down appeals from its African-American members about getting rid of the central jurisdiction, there was nothing else that the General Conference needed to do. Evidently, the majority of its members did not find the existence of a central jurisdiction to be out of conformity with Christian practice. The 1960 General Conference courageously inched forward from its immediate predecessor. In addition to declaring once more that the principles described in its social creed are to be applied alike to all, it updated the creed to specify that, quote, the right to choose a home, enter a school, secure employment, vote, or join a church should not be limited by a person's race, culture, or religion. Further along in paragraph 2026, it declared, our Lord Jesus Christ teaches that all men are brothers. He permits no discrimination because of race, color, or creed. In Christ Jesus, you are all sons of God through faith. By today's standards, that statement seems far from radical. And in the 1960s, to Methodists in the central jurisdiction, it seemed to be a rather basic statement of Christian faith. But a great number of white Methodists in the South who were confronting the facts of the modern civil rights movement, that statement was a clear evidence that the national church had lost touch with important Southern realities and was seeking to impose its leftist will on a section of the church that had, for the most part, or at least according to itself, been handling its affairs quite well, thank you, without Northern interference. When 28 young seminary-trained clergy in Mississippi published a statement in January of 1963 in which they reflected on the racial discord in their state, condemned communism, affirmed public schooling, and dared to quote from that paragraph 2026 from the 1960 Book of Discipline, they met intense opposition. The prelude to the 4 points they made read as follows, quote, confronted with the grave crises precipitated by racial discord within our state in recent months, and the genuine dilemma facing persons of Christian conscience, we are compelled to voice publicly our convictions. Indeed, as Christian ministers and native Mississippians sharing the anguish of all our people, we have a particular obligation to speak. Thus, understanding our mutual involvement in these issues, we bind ourselves together in this expression of our Christian commitment. We speak only for ourselves, though mindful that many others share these affirmations. Born of deep conviction of our souls as to what is morally right, we have been driven to seek the foundation of such convictions in the expressed witness of our church. We therefore, at the outset of this new year, affirm the following. And they went on and made their points about communism and public schooling and so on. Published in the Mississippi Advocate on January 2nd, 1963, every daily paper in the state of Mississippi reported it on January 3rd. The backlash the signers received from their fellow Mississippi Methodists led 17 of them to leave the state by June of 1964. Only 8 remained in the state for the duration of their ministerial careers, and of the 20 who left, 3 managed to eventually return. They suffered death threats, ostracism, and even some acts of violence. Some of their churches just stopped paying them. For the most part, church superiors, bishops, and district superintendents were either silent or hostile to the signers, chastising some and relegating them to smaller rural charges that were unable to financially support a young pastor with a growing family. Any who did not lend their support to the signers quietly could expect to receive the same hostile treatment. The promises encountered by the signers some 2 decades after the formation of the Methodist Church highlight some fundamental flaws in the church's design and development. The union of Northern and Southern churches in 1939 was to be a merging of 2 mighty Methodist streams that together would become an even mightier river that, due to its superior numbers and breadth across the nation, would not only lend it bragging rights among American Protestants, but allow it to have an influential voice in guiding the morals and character of the nation. The reunion was bought at the expense of the church's African-American members, who were never expected to fully enjoy the results of the merger. Morris Davis, and I thank him in this moment in absentia, whose excellent work analyzing the 1930s rhetoric of the Joint Commission on Union, has expressed well the compromise the central jurisdiction represented and the perceived gain the white advocates of reunion at any cost believed they had attained. And I quote, "The failure of the Joint Commission, its inability to solve the problem of racial membership, shows us clearly the relationship between racial membership and concerns about political and national influence. The fear that white Americans outside Methodism would perceive the church to be endorsing inappropriate racial equality was greater than the opportunities inherent in becoming the largest and first mainline church in America to embrace full racial equality. But even those who might have believed, in an idealistic sense, that the new Methodist Church would better reflect Christian values if it were integrated, were willing to forego the spiritual ideal for one they wanted more, that of a large, powerful, internationally influential church that would lead the world's greatest Christian civilization," unquote. In some ways, those who thought the price African Americans paid for reunion was worthwhile succeeded in ways they did not foresee in 1939. The Methodist Church did indeed become the largest Protestant church in 1939, despite the non-merger of the staunchly segregationist Southern Methodist Church. And the church did influence the morale, the morals and character of the nation. Having the largest Protestant church build segregation into its constitution gave succor and support not only to Southern Methodists uncomfortable with a fully integrated church, but to others outside the church who wanted to know if Jim Crow could be Christian. To those who asked that question, the Methodist Church, with its central jurisdiction, answered with a resounding yes. By sacralizing Jim Crow in the church, and hence in society as well, Methodists in the North as well as the South could have untroubled consciences regarding segregation and be even more shocked by, disturbed by, and resistant to the reasonable demands being made in the 1950s and 60s by nonviolent demonstrators. In her recent work highlighting the conflicts among Methodists in Neshoba County, Mississippi, Carol V.R. George accurately states, quote, "With the denomination pronounced a blessing on segregation, it made it easier for secular leaders in the state to justify their white supremacist policies," unquote. She goes on further to state that Methodist church segregation, quote, "gave added strength to the state white conferences whose members could now unapologetically identify themselves as, quote, Christian segregationists," unquote, and merged their interests with those of the many segregationist organizations taking root in the state. Just as there were two legally defined race-based school systems, there were now legally defined race-based Methodist conferences in the state and also the nation. The appearance of the central jurisdiction publicly defined the Methodist denomination as pro-segregation, although operationally, Black Methodists worshiped as before at Black Methodist churches and white Methodists at white ones, unquote. Her work is not just a reminder that the victories of the civil rights movement were bought with blood, but highlights as well how the color line dividing Methodists in Mississippi may have actually encouraged violence against Methodists by Methodists. We popularly celebrate the role of religion in dismantling segregation through the efforts of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others. But we must not dismiss the role of religion in strengthening those very same segregationist structures. Neshoba County, Mississippi is the place where Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner went in the summer of 1964, the so-called Freedom Summer, to encourage and assist Black residents to register to vote. They were to be headquartered at Mount Zion Methodist Church in Longdale, Mississippi, a Black church in the central jurisdiction. An effective system of surveillance established by state and non-state actors led to a raid on the church by masked white supremacists. Not finding the three volunteers, they severely beat several church members and returned later that evening, burning the church to the ground. It was sometime later that the three were stopped on the road for an alleged minor infraction and were subsequently discovered sometime later after a massive FBI search. Cecil Price, a deputy sheriff at the time and for a time a member of the Klan, was imprisoned for his role in the murders. He was not convicted, by the way, on state charges of murder, but on federal charges of violating the victim's civil rights. If you're interested, he attended First Methodist Church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a white Methodist church in the same county, but not part of the central jurisdiction, part of the South Central jurisdiction. It should come as no surprise that a number of persons who achieved infamy for their efforts at maintaining white supremacy in the 1960s were Methodist. In states like Alabama and Mississippi, only the Southern Baptist Church had more members than the Methodists, and the overwhelming number of Christians in the South were in either Baptist or Methodist churches. In Alabama, the notorious Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, the Commissioner of Public Safety for the city of Birmingham, was a Methodist, as was John Satterfield of Mississippi, the man whom Time magazine hailed as, quote, the most important segregationist lawyer in the country, unquote. Satterfield was active in Mississippi, in Washington, D.C., and in the Methodist Church, as he regularly represented the state at General Conference, where he managed to defeat or weaken efforts to make the church more inclusive. Satterfield served for a time as president of the American Bar Association, and he drafted legislation that, had it not been struck down by the courts, would have allowed Mississippi Methodist churches to withdraw from the denomination and retain full rights to their buildings and property. He helped organize MAMML, or maybe it was MAML, the Mississippi Association of Methodist Ministers and Laymen, essentially a white citizens' council for the church that was devoted to shoring up the walls of segregation at every and any opportunity. And this included opposing the efforts of the apostate National Council of Churches and its insidious efforts to promote insidious efforts to combat Black poverty and promote interracial cooperation in the Mississippi Delta region. As the 1960s progressed, it was clear that the maintenance of the segregated central jurisdiction was no longer tenable. Previous General Conference action had allowed conferences within the central jurisdiction to merge with coexisting geographic conferences by mutual agreement, and in some areas, the central jurisdiction was severely weakened as a result. But mutual agreement was not to be had in some areas of the country. And when the merger with the Evangelical United Brethren mandated the end of the formal Methodist church segregation, resistance remained. Alabama Methodists chose one of their most prominent members to represent their interests at the Uniting Conference in Dallas. Staunchly segregationist former Governor George Wallace, a Methodist. Even with the formation of the Black Methodists for Church Renewal and the Commission on Religion and Race, vestiges of the central jurisdiction remained in parts of the United Methodist Church until the mid-1970s. As it became increasingly clear that the days of the central jurisdiction were numbered, just like in 1939, they were Methodists determined to avoid further contact with African Americans in the church. W.J. Cunningham served for a short time as pastor of Galloway Methodist Church in Jackson, Mississippi. And he had succeeded W.B. Sella, the church's longtime pastor who left in the wake of the Born of Conviction conflict. Though he supported segregation, he admitted that there were no grounds on which he could prevent persons of color from joining the church. And he submitted his resignation when the church board mandated a policy of strict segregation. Cunningham's short tenure took place during what perhaps has been the most tumultuous time in that church's history. And here he describes an experience from the spring of 1965. For centuries, the Sunday after Easter was called Low Sunday in the Christian calendar, the anti-climax after Easter. But Galloway's lowest Sunday ever, in my opinion, was June 20, 1965, when a large number of its leading members met apart from the church in a coalition to withdraw permanently. The announced purpose of the Greater Schism was to establish a new denomination and, beyond that, to withdraw both the North Mississippi and Mississippi annual conferences from the Methodist Church. This was the beginning of the Independent Methodist Church, so-called at that time, with 2 congregations in Jackson and others scattered over the state, the largest being composed of former members of Galloway. If you're curious, the Association of Independent Methodists continues to exist, although the flagship church established by the several hundred former Galloway members has not survived. Their current website hails their congregational polity, upon which they claim to have grafted a Wesleyan theology. It says nothing about the segregationist impulses that brought it into existence, which would not have surprised Cunningham. He observed, and thank you for your time. He observed, quote, I'm almost done. It is strange that no public news media reported the new denomination as being established for racial segregation. The recognition of, quote, John Wesley Methodism in Mississippi, unquote, the social gospel, quote unquote, and the National Council of Churches aside, the new denomination was founded for reasons of racial segregation. All the dissatisfactions named by the founders were real enough to them, but this is a fact. If Galloway, Capitol Street, and St. Luke's Methodist churches could have remained permanently segregated as a Methodist principle, the independent Methodists would have had no reason for being, unquote. Now, as stated, those hoping that a merged Methodist church in 1939 would have influence over the nation's morals and character succeeded in rather unhelpful ways. Another motivation they had was to claim status as the nation's largest Protestant denomination. On that score, they succeeded for a time. According to the figures reported in the Statistical Abstract of the United States, in 1944, there were 5,667,926 Southern Baptists to 8,046,120 members in the Methodist Church. I'm going to spare you and me reading all the numbers for 1952, 58, 63, and 74. But take my word for it, and if you want, I'll show you the actual numbers. It appears that as the civil rights movement got underway in the late 50s and through the 60s and into the 70s, the Southern Baptists at the Methodist Church lost members. Now, a much more sophisticated analysis of this data is required in order to form firm conclusions, and I'm not sure I'm the best one to do that analysis. But it could be that the conversations and other efforts about fully including African Americans in the life of the Methodist Church encouraged an exodus of members, not only to starting new churches that have been Methodists, the Association of Independent Methodists, or a handful of other congregational style Methodist denominations, and I'll spare you those names and details. But they may also have gone to already established Southern Baptist churches. That denomination, we'll note, has not suffered the pains of reconciling with Black Baptists or Northern American Baptists since its founding in the 1840s. It may be that what the advocates of reunion in 1939 sacrificed African Americans to get, it lost when it finally was forced to confront the reality of having African American members. The formation of the central jurisdiction may have simply delayed the inevitable. It certainly did not promote deep and meaning interracial dialogue among Methodists, either then or now. I'm just going to close with my parenthetical musings. Like this may be where I go from preaching to meddling. It seems to me that diversity in the United Methodist Church offers us in this wonderful church a great opportunity that few denominations have. We're all in this church together. We have opportunities for us to listen deeply to one another and to learn from one another, to open our hearts to the stories and points of views of other folks. And it seems to me, and again, this is my personal anecdotal experience, it seems to me that we don't. For example, Black Methodists are still pretty much in Black Methodist churches, and white Methodists are pretty much in white Methodist churches. And I'm not saying that that's the case throughout. I know, and I should say it's been my experience that even in integrated churches, we may come together to worship, but we don't use that opportunity of Black and white, even in the same church, to have those detailed or deep heart-to-heart discussions, even about current events. So we don't talk about Black Lives Matter. We avoid certain kinds of conversations because we don't want to upset anyone. And we don't share, we don't listen, we don't get those stories, and we don't have an opportunity to be transformed. I wonder if part of what we are going to be contending with in February would have been eased some if, forget the votes, that we're not going to really resolve these issues by voting one side down or one side up. But by being in that heart-to-heart dialogue where we get to really see and hear one another and get to experience a little bit about what the other has gone through, or if we could do a little bit of what John Fawcett talked about in 1782 in his hymn, where he said, we share each other's woes, our mutual burdens bear, and often for each other flows a sympathizing tear. We have that opportunity here in our church, and if we could just make use of it, perhaps we might be able to prevent some of the problems that we now face as a nation. I commend to you, if you didn't get a chance to see it, and probably didn't, June 19th, 2018, Christian Century, Seth Dolan, professor at Pacific Lutheran Seminary, University, wrote a piece called American Evangelicalism and the Politics of Whiteness. And in that piece, he talks about how it is that American evangelicalism has shifted from organizing itself around issues of theology and instead has organized itself in our current day and time around notions of whiteness. And he talks about that to then suggest that may well be the way and the reason that so many evangelicals have been flocking to our current administration, despite the fact that it doesn't have anything like a professed religious perspective that any reasonable Christian, it seems to me, would recognize or support. And I think what he says about American evangelicalism has some impact and import for our United Methodist Church. Now, I don't want to say that, and I guess most of what I've said here has been rather negative, and I don't want anything that I've said here I want to lift up and celebrate the Gilbert Havens in our tradition and the Methodist student movement of the 1950s that absolutely insisted on crossing the color line because it's Methodist students in college, both black and white, could be together and talk together and share together on each other's campuses. I want to lift up saints like Ed King, who was a young clergy person in Mississippi who got rejected out of the ordination process because he dared work with African Americans and participate in protests, and then became the first white pastor as part of the central jurisdiction. And I want to also lift up the work of Methodist women, both in the Southern Church and the Northern Church, who managed to cross the color line with some efficacy. But even as I mentioned those, that has not been enough leaven to transform the lump. And clearly there's much more work to be done. And I don't want to cast any aspersions. I've never been to Ashland Place United Methodist Church in Mobile, Alabama. I've had a chance to glance at their website. They seem to be doing quite well. They've got 11 staff persons whose pictures are on the website. They've got 3 clergy. As I look at the diversity that they have there, the only staff person whose picture is there as a person of color is the assistant building steward. But again, that's the home church of our Attorney General, who proudly claims that he teaches Sunday school there. And I wonder how many of these conversations have taken place there, and if those conversations had taken place, if perhaps he might have been transformed in some significant way. So as we think about this whole issue about the streams that come together for the richness that creates our United Methodist Church, we need to look beyond just saying that we all have the same membership card and look towards true merger that allows for those deep conversations and those transforming experiences that we are all called to have if we truly be followers of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you.
So much richness and food for thought and food for discomfort and food for truth telling. We have about 30 minutes, I think, for conversation before dinner time. And I'm not sure whether Dr. Kisker has the microphone because he is ready with a question.
No.
Or he's the Phil Donahue producer that's going to run around the crowd and make sure that what questions there are among you get asked. He has nodded that though he may have a question,
the latter.
He's not going to lead with it. So what thoughts, questions, comments do you have? And please direct them to the speaker Yeah, why don't you all come up here and we'll just get 3 chairs here.
That's one.
Thank you.
This question is for anyone that wants to answer it. I think I heard one mention, and I believe he recently just passed away, James Cone. And I'd like to know what relevance you think his theology might have for the future.
Who wants to memorialize Dr. Cone?
I believe that Dr. Cone has done a phenomenal and major thing for the churches, for the way we do theology. Many of you are aware of the fact that after he did his Black Theology, Black Power, 1969, he was not even invited back to his own seminary for a while. So only after we had a chance to reflect on that and to think about the possibilities and to talk about what he maintained all along, and that is Blackness is not just a color. You know, it was more about our humanity, the way we relate to one another, processes that are so deeply into the life of the nation. So I think he'll live on to the extent that he has done something very important. Deal with that constructively, as opposed to run from it. There is indeed hope.
I'm just going to add to that I mean, everything he said is absolutely correct, but there's a challenge that he really does put out there for persons who are not of color, you know, and that is he basically invites white persons to become Black, you know, which is to take and place central the conditions and positioning of persons who are marginalized in this society. That requires giving up a whole lot. That's not necessarily about giving up money and so forth, but you know, giving up the sense of privilege that you know people just carry without any kind of reflection because it's so natural. And that's a deep and heavy process, and that's hard lifting. And I would hope that if people would take Cone seriously, they wouldn't just read it and say, well, that's nice, but that they would actually engage the difficult work. And if they do so, yeah, I think we've got some hope.
I think Dr. Cone also lifted up the concept of liberation theology and the fact that all of us, regardless of color, may find ourselves enslaved in some way to the point where we're not free to serve the Christ that we talk about and preach about and sing about. At least not reflect the love. We are so enslaved to our own personal comfort and our privileges and things that make us feel good until we don't take that step of freeing ourselves up to serve Christ and as we serve our brothers and sisters of whatever color.
Another question right here.
Yes, this is for anyone, but especially for Dr. Straker. I hear and I believe in the comment that we just don't have these conversations. And I know in our congregation, that's true. And I see, as we approach the gay issue, that happening in our conference. And the question I'd ask to you or any of you is there a model where we can find a way to mediate a conversation where we can talk to each other and learn what each other is all about? Is that possible? Have you seen that done?
I think the Commission on Religion and Race some years ago, at least, did a marvelous job in helping congregations come together across racial lines and talk with each other, especially a congregation that received news that they were going to receive a pastor who was not of their race, engaging them and talking about race and approaching the issue without that conversation. We make assumptions and we fail in ministering to one another. We must have the conversation.
There is a model that's contained in the process of having conversation. Nelson Mandela helped us a whole lot in that regard. But it is so important, as I always said in my classes, to put it on the table. We refuse to put it up there. It frightens us. We run. We shut down. Instead of working through it. Sometimes it gets heated. As long as we don't jump on each other, go to war. But it's important for us to be able to put the issues on the table and to work through them that way so that we can determine what course of action is the appropriate action for us today.
I'm just going to say that. Oh, I'm going to say that. Oh, I'm going to say this though instead. No, I believe that there are actual models. This is where I get to say, yeah, but I'm a little historian. I don't do all the touchy-feely, psychology stuff, But I'm also going to share what I'm also a little worried sometimes that we'll go ahead and have a workshop, maybe even a several-part workshop, and then, okay, we got that done, we're good, let's keep going. Where what's needed is a sort of ability to be regularly engaged, and to be able to approach each other, I think, with honest, open questions. And hoping for an honest answer that can lead to a real exchange. Listen, I've recently, my bishop asked me, thinking I apparently did not have enough to do, to take on a church part-time. It's about 2.5 hours from where I live. But I said yes, because I'm stupid. Memorial Day weekend, I'm in the church after Sunday service and, taking care of stuff at my desk. And one of my members, I don't have many, came to see me and declared to me that he knew that I was this radical liberal, and he just needed me to know that he's a staunch conservative. Not that I hadn't guessed. But I wanted to know from him, what had I said that so outed me as a liberal? Because I told him I don't believe the pulpit is a place for partisan party politics. And then he gave me some examples, that I had, for example, prayed for the Parkland family, and in a sermon said something about our nation not being able to have a substantive conversation about gun control. But that apparently in the same week that the Parkland shooting took place, somewhere on the planet, a police officer was killed, and I didn't mention the police officer's family. And I told him for the life of me, I didn't remember the police officer being killed, and that maybe the police officer's family would have liked to have had a conversation about gun control, and that if during the prayer time he lifted up as a prayer concern, I'd been glad to pray over it. But it was interesting for me that he felt that the two needed to be balanced off one another, which was kind of odd. But that has led to some email exchanges and some further conversations, because I can't give up on him because I am his pastor. And I have to believe that it's possible that he can be transformed, and I can be a better pastor to him if I fully can figure out or untangle the thoughts that are in his head that motivate him. You know, and so it's remaining engaged. And, you know, I was really blessed that day, because I think my instinct would be to reach for a baseball bat and go and defend myself. And that morning I was just wonderfully relaxed. Well, what do you mean? You know, talk to me, tell me about, and we were able to have an exchange. And whether or not he changes his mind about that, he knows that I did not attack him back. And it's my prayer that when I say something crazy in the future about praying for 8-month-old children to be reunited with their mothers, you know, that maybe even if he doesn't fully agree, he'll be able to hear me differently because I took him seriously, and that I was willing to remain in dialogue with him. I can't tell you how that's going to turn out. I'm praying about it, but my sense is that's my job, if nothing else. And I think that there are ways that we can do that with each other, in addition to all of the trainings that are at least now being mandated in the New York Annual Conference. But, if we retreat back to our various churches and that's where it ends, I don't know how far it actually gets.
My question has to do with sharing culture in worship, in particular, around music. I had the blessing of getting to know Bobby McLean and hearing his story about producing Songs of Zion. And in my own experience, I was taught those songs at a camp that was almost all white people in the 70s, a large body of those songs. So they became my heart language. It affirms what Bobby's vision was for producing that as adding that body of music to the United Methodist Church. And the victory that we have, that so many of those songs are now in our current hymnal, is beautiful. Yet most of the time I'm still serving as pastor. I've mostly served all white congregations, or mostly white congregations. My husband's from Africa, but that's not his heart language. And then last night, as we were leading the Great Camp Meeting in the Promised Land song, we had 2 white women and a white man accompanist leading that song. And I could imagine some folk coming in with some rhetoric that I've been hearing a lot lately about cultural appropriation. How dare you lead that song that isn't yours? And so there's a fear in there. It didn't actually occur to me. I didn't know that song real well, so my bigger fear was just, am I leading it right? Am I singing it right? But beyond that, there's a fear that can sometimes come when I'm meaning well, and someone says, "Oh, that's really not helpful at all." And staying in the dialogue, I'm sure, would be helpful. But what's your take on that?
I'm not all offended. I mean, my sense is that, look, spirituals are folk music. They continue to exist because they continue to speak to communities that continue to perform them, create them, and recreate them in the aspect of performance. And so, as a result, if it speaks to you and it works in the circumstance, in the context of worship, my sense is this is less anybody's particular music as it is God's music or Christ's music. And if it's done with that level of respect and genuineness, I think I'm all for it. So yeah, to be in a congregation that wants to try one of the Korean hymns in the hymnal, or give a shot at, one of the African ones, or give a shot at one of the Latino ones. I think that's perfectly fine if we approach it with the same level of seriousness and respect that we would take one from our tradition. And I can sing a Charles Wesley one, can't I? I don't think he was black, but
We have time for 2 more questions, and I think they have already been
foreordained.
Yeah, possession is 9/10 of the law, and I have the microphone. Okay, can you tell where I'm from my accent?
Yes.
I oftentimes think I should just keep my mouth shut, and Fred Day knows I'm somewhat outspoken, so I'm a little bit nervous, but I want to have these conversations. I'm from South Carolina. I've studied quite a bit race relations in the early part of the church. And I have a comment, but I wanted to ask, are you all familiar with the Richard Holloway scrapbook at the Avery Research Center at the College of Charleston? Because Richard Holloway was an African-American Methodist class leader, a very important lay person, but a class leader, and in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he and Castile Selby and others were very important in the Black community, Methodist community in Charleston. They were freed. And there was a considerable small minority percentage of free Blacks in that area, but there's a lot of rich history that I just wanted to make sure you might be very interested in that. You can get that online, the Richard Holloway scrapbook. It's great. I grew up lower middle class. I was not part of a what I would call a white privileged society. We were all poor where I grew up. We were all the Blacks there were not significantly more poor than I was. So when I first heard the term white privilege, I felt somewhat offended by that. I had to work hard to move up in the world just like anybody did. I didn't understand what that meant. I understand it more now, I think, because I do try to be open-minded, but in the interest of trying to have the dialogue, and you've encouraged that and you want to hear, I feel it's important that I express some of the reactions I've had as someone coming from the Southern perspective. There are times when I feel on the defensive because I hear sort of a northern elitism, a sanctimony about the southern states. There was Darrell can tell you about the trouble he had in California having a church that was Methodist Episcopal Church South recognized as a historical site. It is now recognized, I understand, but there's sort of a prejudice against white Southerners, I feel sometimes. So, and there's also, setting aside black versus white, there's also a prejudice I feel when I go into more elite academic areas against someone from the South. It's just you're ignorant, you're backwards, you come from the hills, you're a redneck. I mean, there are sometimes comments made, and there was, and I don't want to disparage anyone, but I'm just reacting to what he said last night. But our minister last night used the anecdote of seeing a big truck with a saying on it that was pro-Second Amendment. So there was some sort of undertone of disparagement against that person. But yet all of us here talk about we should love the other. It's the stranger. We should love them. We should understand them. So it kind of goes both ways. I'm not promoting any particular ethos or viewpoint. I'm just saying that was my reaction. I come from an area where a lot of people ride around in big trucks. They ride around in big trucks, and yes, many of them do consider themselves Christian. Many of them are not. Many of them are ne'er-do-wells, we would say. You know, but nevertheless, we are called to hear everyone. And I was somewhat just like, I wish he hadn't said that. So, but that's kind of me being open about sort of the reactions. And I don't want to offend Dr. McLean because I think he's wonderful. But when we were in Chicago, Dr. McLean gave a powerful sermon, but he said in that wonderful, strong, booming voice of his about the Black Renewal Church, it's just as much our church as it is anyone else's, remember? It's just as much our, and I thought, well, of course it is. Of course it is. I didn't understand, you know, why were you saying that so aggressively, especially to a relatively friendly audience?
You want me to defend myself?
Yeah.
We don't have enough time to do that.
But you know, you've encouraged us to dialogue, and that's what I'm doing, because that was how I felt. So if you want to hear how a white person from the South feels, I mean, I didn't grow up feeling prejudice.
Wait a minute. Speak for you, because
Yeah.
I'm from South Georgia. Speak for you. I didn't feel offended. Yeah, sorry.
No, but what I'm saying is, I said to myself, well, of course it's just as much church. I don't feel any, even though we've had segregation, I don't feel that today. We have a number of Black people in my white church. Our minister of music is Black. I love singing spirituals, and I don't feel that's culturally appropriate. I grew up culturally inappropriate. I grew up singing those.
Can I say just a word though?
Yeah.
And hope that when you feel that way, you could accept those famous words of Joan Rivers. Can we talk? Because some of us feel that in a very real way. You know, I grew up in Georgia, and I saw something in that image. But in the sermon, I was more taken by the fact that he said, well, there are different stones. You know, and the experience of the stones of one person is different to another. That's where we need to be able to talk. And some people will engage that that conversation, just as Dr. Straker was saying. Now, other people will get angry with it. But that's the one thing I think that can happen that will help us to understand it better.
We have one more question right here.
As you've been speaking, which I have deeply appreciated, I feel like there has been a description of the reality of the United Methodist Church and of things that I simply didn't know about our history. So I want to thank you for that. I'm reflecting on these conversations, my own research as a New Testament scholar on the formation of the early church. At the core of that was the outreach that Jesus initiated with those on the other side of the cultural divide between Jews and Gentiles. So the church was formed in the context of deep misunderstanding, cultural miscommunication, and at the core, I think, of Jesus' death was his advocacy for dialogue, for doing good with those on the other side of cultural and racial separation. So my question is, just as I try to think about what is the way forward for the Christian church at this time in history in relation to the divisions that have been present for now these many centuries, in relation to the community of Israel and the divisions that exist. What are the ways that you see for us as a United Methodist Church, a way forward in relation to creating a truly integrated, multicultural United Methodist Church?
I have one response, and it's not the only response to that. As we listen to some of the earlier papers today, I was reminded, not in an angry way, but I was reminded of what has happened to the world over the last 500 years. And I've, in part, when I look at mission programs, we miss the boat when it comes to missions, because missions, especially in the poor end of the world, requires a different kind of response than we often give. And when we, as I again say in my classes, when we do the sociology of it, we realize that over the last 500 years, the predominantly white cultures led by white men have ripped and torn through most of the world. And in part, you have gained an advantage that other people do not have. And we've got to work through that. And part of what we're seeing now is the need for us to work through that in some kind of. So it's so very important for us to do that assessment and to realize the pain and the hurt that many people of color. Does that mean that white people don't hurt? No. White people hurt too and experience awful things in their lives. But when we look at the larger picture, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with King Leopold of Belgium. You know what he did to Africa with the help of other Europeans. I mean, so and it's important for us to be able to do that if we're going to come out of a different place as brothers and sisters in this world.
I'm going to try and just add one little piece of this very quickly, and that is, look, if we're going to move forward, we're going to stumble. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get it right all the time. We may not get it right most of the time. But if we have, and I'm even teaching, going to preaching now, right? Love is not irrelevant to who we are supposed to be as Christians. Amen. And we need to approach one another in love and be, and be open truly in that spirit, and then even if we get it wrong at times, it won't be a harsh wrong or a wrong that we can't recover from. And we need to posit the best of intentions on those with whom we disagree, whether they deserve it or not. Because if we write them off as having bad intentions and therefore not worth being in dialogue with, then we erect walls that we can't get past. And so, love, again, I'll end the sermon, but, we can't look as, we're the church. I expect us to do better in Washington, D.C. I really do, and I feel most hurt and most depressed when we in the church are incapable of that. And that's one of my problems when we solve issues by voting one side up and one side down instead of agreeing to just be in continual dialogue until we figure out a way to get it right. I'm done.
Amen. I need to preface this very quickly. I'm under my 59th year of active appointment in the church. I love the United Methodist Church, but maybe we need to listen to the Pope, who told us about 3 weeks ago that he thought one of the most important things for us to do in these issues and all other issues before us is to all of us accept a little less, whether it's position or power or prestige, so that everybody can have a bit.
Amen.
Thank you for a stimulating time, a stimulating conversation. Dr. Straker, I have to say to you that I grew more and more uncomfortable when you talked about the conservative white guy in your congregation with a fascination for guns and kept looking at me. I don't know whether anybody else noticed that, but I was really uncomfortable about that. I think you and I need to sit down and have a talk. Time for dinner, Luther? Any other announcements to make before dinner?
Yeah, let's go eat.
How about we ask Jim to pray us?
Yes. How about Jim?
I never know whether to say, let us pray, or will you pray with me? Either way, let's pray together. We've been talking about some problems that have been with us, Lord, for a long, long time. And we're not talking about ultimate solutions, but we are talking about the future of our relationship with one another and with your Son, our Savior, Jesus. Give us eyes that can see clearly and ears that can hear clearly and voices that can speak without too many words that others might hear. Thank you for furnishing us food to nourish our bodies and fellowship to nourish our souls. Amen.
Amen.
We need to find our spouse.